Okay, so we're recording, and this is day 2 of Reimagine Your Hip Joints. And we have a couple folks here. Both of you were with us yesterday when we did the first Awareness Through Movement lesson, which was called, I don't have it right in front of me exactly, but it was something like the frog movement and the leg and the arch. Okay, and sorry, I looked at my phone because I saw a message from someone who's in this class, but I was just making sure they weren't having trouble joining us or something. So that was, in any case, you remember the frog leg movements we did yesterday. And so far, only one of you, it seems like I'm able to hear you, but either, like Lisa, you could come in on the chat if you wanted, but I'm just curious to hear, how you felt after the lesson, the rest of the day, if you notice any difference in any other activities. I'm kind of looking at you, Colette, because I know you're the one whose microphone works. But yeah,
Mine works. Yeah, you hear me?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Well, I had a bit of a back pain yesterday. Not afterwards, but tomorrow. Okay, I start again. Today I had back pain. And
Today.
Yeah, but I also had my son on my lap. So I think, yeah, I don't know. Oh,
Inconclusive about whether the something happened from the lesson in terms of the rest of your day.
Yes, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. It was a great feeling afterwards.
Good.
And I stayed up late at 12 o'clock midnight. The course ended here. So, but I stayed late because it was such a nice feeling, and I didn't want to go to bed and not enjoy this feeling.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so yeah, and it's an interesting question when we do something where we get a much better feeling, and yeah, we want to hang on to it. So your strategy was to stay up late, but yeah, something may be different the next day, and I think what's important is, of course, in the case of doing a class like this, you have your recordings, you could go back and revisit the lesson, but what we'd love is for the experience of the lesson to have the possibility of accessing it again, not necessarily by doing the lesson over and over each time. So just another thing to keep in mind here, since we're going to do 3 days in a row of Awareness Through Movement, and Colette, I know you do a lot of Awareness Through Movement, so it might not be a new idea to you, but maybe a good reminder, is just the idea that we do these particular things in the lesson, and we pay attention to particular things, and we talk about those things throughout the course of the lesson. But then, as the lesson goes on, each time we check in, how do we feel lying on the floor? We notice a feeling, and that feeling maybe shifts. And then from the very beginning of the lesson to the very end, there's a shift in feeling, and we kind of just have this feeling at the end. And if we wiped our memory clean of how we got there, we could still imagine paying attention to the feeling, right? Paying attention to the feeling itself. So again, yesterday we talked about the use of the legs and whether or not the back was participating. We had this metaphor of the quiet back. So if you did have a nice feeling at the end, and the lesson, just as one example, and this focus on the quiet back, you could kind of connect that feeling of the quiet back to the nice feeling you had. Maybe on another day where you don't quite have that feeling and you don't have time to do the lesson, you could still try to orient your attention to, what was that feeling that I associated with a quiet back? Is my back quiet right now? It's not the same as you just spent, an hour doing this kind of self-care that's embedded in the Feldenkrais process. But there's a way that I think we can look to orient towards the feelings we have and kind of imprint them and put them in there so we can come back to them. So that's just one thought about that. I see you, Christine, although I don't see your face. I see you've joined us.
Hi, sorry I'm late. I'm just getting set up. So I'll put on my video when I'm set up.
Okay, that's fine. I was just talking to Colette a little bit about her experience after the lesson. And if you wanted to share anything about how things went after the lesson since yesterday, any different feeling in the hip joints or just in general, love to hear about it.
I actually, my back felt better. The idea of length in the spine, and I was mostly thinking a lot about my thoracic spine during the ATM, and I don't know, I just felt like I was just moving easier, and that included my hip because I have problems with my hip, but when the rest of my back is moving better, then I don't feel the heaviness on my right side of my hip as much. Because my right hip is it's now okay, this is right. It has tendency to be up, but now in this plane it's more even most of the time, but it's still torqued. Like in this plane, my right hip, when I'm lying on the ground, my right hip is off the ground more than my left, or my sacrum.
Okay.
So I think then that translates into some difficulty and a lot of differences between my two sides. And I felt like after yesterday's class, I had just felt more lightness. And normally I feel more like crunchy, heavy.
Yeah, terrific.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a couple things there that I think are interesting. One, I won't go into the idea at length because I just basically what I was talking about with Colette, but just this idea that there's a nice feeling. One thing we can do with that is not so worry so much about what did we do in the ATM that produced the feeling, but just notice the feeling, really zero in on the feeling, and maybe that feeling itself is something we can orient back towards. And it seems like a striking thing for you because you have this general sort of expectation of what the hips and the back feel like normally, and then there's this shift. And so, you know, what's really great to sort of try to imprint as much as possible is like, wow, that thing I usually feel doesn't have to be the norm. There is this other feeling that my body can produce through its own movement, through my attention. So the more that we orient towards the new feeling, if we prefer it, we can shift towards the idea of making that the norm. Of course, keeping that does involve some sense of how did we get there. I think one of your comments, which was more specific, is actually really useful to think about, is you talked about the weight of the spine coming down, right? And so we were lying on the floor, but what we talked about, as I mentioned maybe a little too late at the end, we'll talk about right from the beginning today, is the idea of length through the spine. In other words, the head moving up, and could be lying on your back, but the head moving up away from the feet, up away from the hip joints, right? If you just imagine that you did wake up with a nice feeling in your hip joints, one way that might go away is if you were walking around, some annoying person was just putting their hand on top of your head and pushing down everywhere you went. It's like they'd be pushing you down into the hips, right? So there's a way that we would like the spine to be lifting up out of the pelvis. And it's just a nice image. And of course, you're very aware of your left and right. So hopefully as we go through the lesson today, you'll be aware of that difference in how you work too. So maybe I need a little more care, a little more attention, a little more time on one side or the other. Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know you mentioned the length towards the end, but what was great for me was then after you mentioned it, I took it in and I thought, oh, good. What I had been doing previously in the lesson was achieving that, only I didn't realize it. I was thinking about it and I was thinking about my thoracic spine more, but I was like, oh, it's good. I'm on the right.
That's great. So because in fact,
confirmation.
we do want to eventually marry the good feeling to the idea of what we're doing. So if we notice when I have length, I have this feeling and I like it better. And when I don't quite have the movement the way I wish, actually I can notice that the line of the spine feels a little shorter in that movement. Then we can orient towards a long spine. And what we'll do today, you'll see it's right there in the original version that Feldenkrais taught. He's just every single time he gives the movement that he's going to say, and keep this image of a long spine. So you hear me saying it. Since a couple of you are on the floor, I just want to invite you for a moment back to the screen, because we're going to get into this lesson. But I really think it'll be helpful if you see something first, because this is the lesson that for me was the most unusual lesson, at least of these three. It is, I think, an unusual lesson, but I think it's terrific what Feldenkrais came up with. But it really depends on this particular image that we're going to use, and I just wanted to create the image for you in case there's any confusion, because I can tell you, in working with the transcript of the lesson, it took me quite a while, and I was making drawings and trying to understand what he means. But what's going to happen for a good portion of this lesson is we're going to be working with imagery, sometimes just pure imagery. That is, we won't be doing a movement, we'll just be working mentally to construct an image. And then at another point, which can also be another level of challenge, we'll be working with actual physical movements and simultaneously working with this image. So this lesson, we had some challenges yesterday of one kind. One of the big challenges today is the use of the attention. But I'm going to invite you to, again, just have this idea when it becomes too much. All right, it's too much. You take a break, you come back to it. But this is a little bit rough here. If I was better prepared, I'd have an actual string. This is like a cord or a cable. But the important thing is he's going to talk to you, or I'm going to talk to you, in fact, about a string that's tied in a circle with a knot, okay? And we're going to put the string in different parts of the body, not on the arm. We're going to put it on the legs. But what I want you to imagine is that if you tied a string around your leg, just pretend this is my leg, and it had a knot, you could think of the position of the knot. And so what Feldenkrais asks is that you tie a string with a knot, and then he's going to ask you to make quarter turns of the string. So I'll do a quarter turn of this knot towards the camera, and that's taking the knot 1/4 turn, and then returning to the center. And eventually you're going to do a quarter turn, and then you're going to do 2 quarter turns or a half turn, so that it goes from, I'm probably going to use reference points of like when you're lying on your back. So if this is your leg lying on the back, there's the top, right? There's the bottom, and you can think of the 2 sides. So I'll be giving you instructions that relate to turning either right or left, but you'll be turning around, okay? So is that image clear enough? Okay, and so you'll see when we begin to work with it, and I don't know if any of you saw, I actually wrote a blog post a little bit about what we're doing today, so I described a little bit, but I think what you'll find, and I'll be curious to hear afterwards, I think you'll find that this imagery opens up some very subtle sensations that you might not actually get through thinking, I want to move my body in this particular way, but by using this image, you'll feel things happen. And so I just think it's really pretty amazing that Feldenkrais came up with this, because he's trying to get you to have these little feelings and to work with them in a very interesting way. Okay, so that was what I wanted you to see, and if you are ready, you can now go ahead and get comfortable lying on your back on the floor. So I'll just wait a moment till I see that everyone's there. And once again, it would be great if you directed your camera so I can see you. Christine, I don't know why, but your image is frozen. I don't know if maybe if you went to your computer, maybe turned the video off and then, oh no, now I can see. Yeah, you turned your head and I can see it. Okay. Lisa, are you ready to go? Maybe you're frozen too, because yeah, it appears that your image isn't moving. All right, I'm hoping that I will see you on the floor in a minute, but I'm gonna go on the assumption that you're there. Oh, now you're moving now. Okay. Well, I'm gonna begin, but just, is there a question? Let me see if it looks like you're trying to talk to me and we haven't had a lot of luck with your audio. Sorry, folks, I just want to make sure Lisa's ready to go here. Lisa, can you try typing into the chat if you have a question or something is going on here? Or if everything's okay, just type in the chat everything's okay so that, yeah, I'm not entirely sure. There's something about your connection because now the image is not moving. But, okay. Well, I'm going to need to start, I think. I can't tell whether you're able to get to the floor and follow along or not, but, oh, we've lost her. Okay, something's going on with Lisa's setup. All right. Let's make a beginning here then. Colette's way ahead of you, Christine. She's very comfortable now. She's been on the floor for a while. Okay, Lisa's back. I'm hoping that things will work out for her. So, as you lie on your back, hi, Lisa. Your internet is low. Oh, you made a sign. Thank you. Well, I hope you're able to follow along. If there ends up being a problem, you'll have the recording later. But we've begun now. So just check out, since we've been talking about length, just move your attention through each of your limbs, each of your legs, each of your arms, and also the line of the spine, and just move your attention so that you're trying to get a sense of the length of that whole limb. So the leg, from the heel all the way into the hip joint. If it's your arms, from the tip of the fingers. Okay, I see you, Lisa. Sorry that you're having those technical difficulties. I will, yeah, great. You'll get the recording. Okay. And we talked already about the length of the spine. Just feel, what do you feel? You bring your attention to your spine right now. And just roll your head on the floor, a little left and a little right. Feel how that is. How far down the spine do you feel it when you roll the head? Okay, and let's, as I mentioned, I think yesterday, in this lesson, we will momentarily, if we just follow the script from Moshe Feldenkrais, we will visit momentarily the frog leg lesson. But since we're building these together, just for a moment, don't stand the feet just yet. But as we began yesterday, just take one leg and roll it a little to the outside over the heel. Either leg, just roll the leg in and out over the heel. Feel what that's like, if it's any different than it was yesterday at the beginning. And notice what happens with your pelvis, what happens in your spine. And if you do find that something changes in the spine or the pelvis, what you might find is if you did a similar movement but a much smaller movement, there might be a range where you don't feel the need to activate in other places, but just play with it a little bit with one leg and then with the other leg. Okay. Just notice the balance of the pelvis on the floor. Christine was talking about her usual pattern with the hip joints, but even if you have a sense of what your pattern is, it's always good to ask the question and really listen inside and feel, because some days the pattern shows up a little more, some days it shows up a little less. So just notice the relationship of the two hip joints to the floor and to each other. And now, since we're going to begin what we're doing with the feet standing, use it as an opportunity to just see what you remember from the lesson yesterday. So if you like, you could take your time to stand one foot by rolling the leg, the knee goes to the outside, the heel to the inside, and see if it helps to, as you do this, imagine that the spine stays long. Maybe as you start the movement, you might feel, if you didn't have a deliberate attention to the spine, there's a way that you might feel that the spine wants to shorten. So just notice if there's that tendency there, and then see if you can imagine that the line of the spine has enough kind of power in it that the movement of the leg does not have to shorten it. Or even if there is some change in the spine, if you could continue to orient in such a way that the spine doesn't just collapse with the movement. Maybe there's a change, but you're still thinking of length through the spine. Okay, so once you've figured out a little bit of where you're at compared to yesterday, it may well be that the movement doesn't feel like the end of yesterday's lesson, but maybe it's a little different than where you started yesterday. But do come to the place where you have both feet standing. And now have the feet about shoulder width apart, and please cross your right leg over the left. Okay. Now, if you've done a lot of Feldenkrais lessons, this is a familiar situation. You're going to cross at the knee, so it's not the ankle resting on the knee, but it's the crook of one knee resting on the other knee. So it might be a familiar thing to you, but I'm going to ask you to move very small and slow as you tilt both legs like this a little to the right, and then come back. And some people get very interested in how close the knees can go to the floor. But I'd like to invite you to make the movement very small. Feldenkrais actually emphasizes many times that the movement should be done very slowly. And can you do this movement in such a way that as you follow the rhythm of your breathing, it's as if the legs weren't doing anything. There's no sense that the breath gets interrupted. And you just feel how the back of the pelvis moves over the floor, how the outer edge of the left foot comes a little off the floor, and you go to the inside of the sole of the foot, come back. And another particular thing is we sometimes think of this movement as tilting the legs as if it's the weight of the knees just pulling. Now, if you do that, notice what happens to the spine. Now, this movement can't help but change the spine. However, if you were to think of this idea of length, and rather than thinking it's the weight of the knees to the side that is generating what you're doing, what if you thought of turning the pelvis into the floor to carry the legs to the side and still think of a long spine? Now, long doesn't mean it can't change shape. but you have this orientation to length through the spine. And it's as if you could pause with the legs in any position and still be breathing, just the same way you are at the starting position, because you're simply shifting the place where you're finding support from the floor from one place to another. And you're not trying to push the legs as far as you can go. Okay, bring the legs back and uncross them. Just keep the feet standing. So now you'll do something that is not found very often in the Feldenkrais lessons. Cross your legs the same way, the right leg over the left. But this time, you tilt the legs to the left. So make it small. So cross the right leg over the left leg, which is what you just did. And last time I asked you to tilt to the right. Now the legs are crossed the same way, but please tilt in the opposite direction. Tilt a little to the left. And again, see if you can notice, are you having the sensation that the legs are falling and pulling the pelvis, pulling the spine? Or can you do a small, slow movement where the breath is free and you're really deliberate about how you're shifting the weight over the back of your pelvis in such a way that you're not having the sensation of falling that makes you catch the breath. And now just take the legs maybe just 1 or 2 inches, once to the left and once to the right. So you alternate. And see if you can feel any difference between the movement in one direction or the other. Obviously, there's an asymmetry in the legs. So how does that show up? How does it show up in your hip joints, in your spine, in your chest? Keep the movement small enough that you can go about the same distance in both directions, but really being gentle, emphasizing the breath. Okay, and uncross your legs, rest on the floor. You can lengthen the legs. I won't say it every time, but if you rest with the legs long and then we work with the feet standing, that's a transition that happens in many Feldenkrais lessons where you just want to rest and then you want to move from a certain position. But since you've just done a frog leg lesson, you can take the opportunity whenever you wish to practice that movement. Just feel what's happened for you after crossing the legs in a particular one-sided way and moving to both sides. And then stand your feet. And you'll explore the same idea, but you will change the crossing of the legs. So cross the left leg over the right this time, beginning from the feet standing, and start with a few movements of tilting the legs to the left, but again, not so that you can try to put the knees on the floor, but so that you can feel the possibility of continuing an easy breath, and orienting towards where you're finding support from the floor in each moment. And then after you've moved to the left a few times, feel what it's like to take the legs to the right. And go a little left and a little right. And maybe you're making a movement with your head, or maybe you're not. Just notice how this compares to the movement you did with the other crossing of the legs. And any hint of willpower or wanting to do more or wanting to push or wanting something to be different than what it is right now, see if you can, if you can't turn that off, if you can just sort of step outside of that voice and observe yourself as if from the outside or as if from looking down, and just find out, if you don't try to change what is and you just go with what it is, just become interested in it. Interested in the experience, the sensation. Okay, uncross the legs and rest. And notice what's happened after exploring this movement on the other side. Any patterns or biases that you noticed when you first lay down? Has there been any shift just by exploring this one simple movement with a couple variations? Okay, so now with your legs remaining long on the floor, reach your arms forward towards the ceiling and bring your hands together so you interlace the fingers and shape your arms kind of like a hoop so you have a roundness to them. Great. And now, can you move your head and your shoulders to one side so that you take the hoop to one side? So you roll a little bit. No, you take the head and the shoulders and everything the same direction. So you lift, let's say, the left shoulder to take the hoop to the right, and then you lift the right shoulder to take the hoop to the left. Okay. Now, again, in the original lesson, Feldenkrais made a real emphasis on doing this slowly. He pointed out, if you do this quickly, I'm paraphrasing, but he says something like, you won't learn how the ribs can surrender to the floor on each side. So don't worry about the size of the movement again. You can keep it small. The idea, he doesn't state it, but I believe the idea here is that the legs are mostly quiet. But whereas we began with a movement of the legs and felt something in the spine, just notice as you take the hoop, what do you feel in the pelvis? So your head is turning also, just to be sure. I can't completely see what both of you are doing in this particular movement. But it's as if you were looking at the place where your fingers meet so that your head rolls one direction and the other. Just notice if it's simpler on one side. But rather than just thinking of what's happening with your arms in the air, can you really think of the back side of your body and how you're finding support from the floor point by point? This is what Feldenkrais means when he says, how do your ribs surrender to the floor? And just notice, when does it feel like a movement that involves the chest and the sternum, or when are you just doing something with your arms alone? Okay, rest your arms on the floor. And please stand your feet now. Just notice the contact of your low back with the floor here. And now you're going to make the hoop again, but please change the interlacing of your fingers from last time. So as we did this yesterday, the non-habitual interlacing, changing which fingers on top. And now we'll do what Christine was starting to do. Take your shoulders, your chest, and your arms in one direction, but turn the head and the eyes to look in the other direction. And again, can you do this slowly? And one way to think of this is if you were to take the arms one way and take the head the other way and pause for a moment, you could feel that you were supporting yourself on the floor along one side of your back and along the opposite side of your head. So the arms don't change. The arms are in a static shape. It's as if they're really, the arms and the chest together are one shape. So then when you switch and turn the chest and the whole hoop that's connected with it one way and the head to the other, can you feel the pressure moving from one side of the back to the other and simultaneously in the opposite direction, moving from one side of the back of your head to the other? And it could be interesting at any point to just pause in one of these asymmetrical positions and feel your breath there. Feel your support from the floor and how you breathe. And then try another shape, find out how you breathe. Again, just thinking, how can you get to know the floor as you do this? Okay, and leave that alone. And lengthen your legs. Okay, so here's the moment where I was going through the transcript and I decided, oh, I should put these two lessons together. He asks you to stand the right leg and then to lengthen it. And what's interesting is at first he doesn't tell you how to do it. So we did the frog leg lesson yesterday. But if you like, just think about how you would spontaneously respond to the instruction to stand the right leg and then to lengthen the right leg. Now, especially if you've done a lot of Feldenkrais lessons, if you've been through something like this before, you might find that the frog leg is your go-to move. But you could also just slide the heel sort of directly up under the knee. But begin the process of standing the right leg, lengthening the right leg. And then here's the first time that he makes this comment. He says, can you do this movement without shortening your spine? Christine might be doing this in her imagination. If you are, that's fine. Okay, but you're standing the right leg. And then the more he talks, and you can assume he's giving some time for people to explore, he says, well, there is a particular way that you can stand the leg without shortening your spine. And that particular way involves the knee going to the outside and the heel going to the inside. But he only talks about it this one time in the lesson. He does use another interesting phrase, and I'll just tell you what he says and see what you make of it. He says, pull the leg up from the spine. So the way I interpret it is it's as if this orientation to the length, in other words, this movement up through the top of the head, is part of the impulse that helps you draw the leg up. That's my interpretation. But in any case, you're standing the right leg and lengthening the right leg with attention to a long spine. Okay, now go ahead and let the leg lie long on the floor again. And now's the moment where we're going to begin working with this image. And so I demonstrated before we began with a string tied around my arm. I'm going to ask you to, in your imagination, you're going to have, in fact, two strings. So would you please now just imagine that someone comes and takes a string and they tie it around your right leg just below the kneecap. Okay? You can even maybe imagine how they tighten the string and they tie off the knot, and the knot is going to be right on the front. In other words, the knot is oriented towards the ceiling. Now, they're going to tie a second string just above the right kneecap. So at the bottom end of your thigh, so that you have two strings, one above the knee and one below the knee, with the knots right on top. Okay? And now in your imagination, the knots are, it's comfortable, but it's fairly tight. You can sort of feel that knot there, those two knots, above and below the right knee. And so you imagine, we'll just say it happens magically, you don't need another person there, but it's as if these two strings tied around your right leg, above and below the right knee, began to turn, so that the knots that were facing the ceiling, the strings turned to the right, and they would move 1/4 of a turn to the right, so that the knots were now facing the wall to your right. They're on the outside of your knee. So this is all in the imagination. Okay? And then you simply imagine that the knots turn back to the ceiling. So many times, just imagine this movement of the knots turning 1/4 turn to the right and coming back. And see if you can imagine, just make it clearer, and see if you begin to notice some little sensation that's there. And now, as you continue to do this movement, can you bring your attention also to the spine? And you think that the spine remains long. Now, it'd be interesting if you like, you could do the movement once and just observe the spine with no intention. Is there something that happens inside of you when you imagine this knot that's turning? So it's not asking you to move the leg. You're imagining that your leg just lies there, but the knots that are tied are rotating around your leg. So there's enough slack that the knots can be turned to the outside. And just feel if there's some muscular response inside the leg. And then come back to the middle, pause for a moment. And then renew this image, but maybe it creates a little bit more of a sensation. You're going to take them 2 segments so that you turn first, the knots above and below the knee turn to the outside of the leg, and then they continue to turn so they would be on the back of your leg facing the floor. And then they return along the outside of your right leg to the place where they're facing the ceiling again. So you turn the knots around to the right, a half turn, so they come to the back of your leg, and then they come back to the front. But notice, is something happening in the leg, and is there some impact there on the spine? In any case, can you keep your attention on the spine in such a way that the spine, you feel it has length? And there's 2 other particular things that Feldenkrais asks for throughout the lesson, and we'll keep coming back to them. So in addition to this long spine, can you have a free breath? Free and easy breath. You're still turning these knots a half turn around to the back of your right leg and then returning. Okay. And go ahead and rest. Just let go of the image for a moment. Just notice the sensation of your right leg on the floor and your left leg. And now, would you please allow your face to make a smile? Smile and let go. And just notice how ready is your face to actually make a smile. So you know if you are in good company and good spirits and someone says something funny, the smile is spontaneous. The smile is available, it's ready. But if someone just asks you, please smile, it doesn't always feel like the face was prepared for that. As you make a smile, and to be specific, it's a smile where you expose the teeth. So smile such that you expose the teeth and then relax the mouth again. See if you notice some change in your chest when you smile. And now, if you were to, just for a moment, kind of stiffen the chest just a little bit, you probably feel that would affect your ability to smile as well. So I don't want to encourage you to stiffen the chest very much, but if you would like to find an easy smile, can you also think of this idea of having an easy chest, having softness in the chest? Good. Okay. And so now return to these knots that are around the right knee, one knot above the kneecap, one knot below. And as you did before, turn the knots to the outside, to the right. Turn them one turn and come back. And then turn 2 turns, or 2 quarter turns. So it's a half turn. So the knots come to the back side of your leg and then return. And now turn 3/4 of a turn. So they go to the outside, underneath, and come to the inside of your leg. And then by the same route, you reverse and take them back around to the starting place. And as you do this, can you feel length in your spine, an easy breath, and if you wish, you could smile. But what Feldenkrais talks about in any case is a readiness to smile. So as this image, as you allow this image to continue, this turning of the knots 3/4 of a turn to the right so that they come to the inside of your left leg. And now that you've done that a few times, you could turn these 2 knots in a full circle to the right so that they come back to facing the ceiling, and then to return, you go to the left to come back. And all the while, an easy breath, an ease in the face that could allow you to smile and expose the teeth. You can try doing it. Lengthen the spine. So there's a lot to pay attention here too. But maybe this idea of the face that can smile or lengthen the spine, it becomes a sensation that you can just kind of program it in a little bit, and you don't necessarily have to, let's say, watch the spine, watch the face in each moment, watch the knots. But all 3 of these things are important. And don't forget the breath. So that's a 4th thing. There are 4 items here that he's asking you to pay attention with. So you might find that your attention moves back and forth. But the constant is this movement of the knots around your leg. Okay, so let go of that. Again, feel the right leg now versus the left leg. And this is just, again, my own way of thinking of it. It's not what Feldenkrais said, but you didn't do any deliberate movements of the right leg, but I think what happens with this imagery is that there is a very small muscular response in the right leg. And we often talk in a Feldenkrais lesson about using less effort. So I can't think of a way to use much less effort than to just imagine the movement. But if you feel something happen, it is almost as if you did a small movement. And if you think about the knots turning to the outside, if you were to create a movement, can you see how it might be the beginning of that frog leg, right? In the frog leg lesson, he wants you to have a long spine as you do the movement. Here, it's as if you're doing a miniature of that movement through this image, and you're still looking for a long spine. But now if you bring your attention back to the right knee and think of the knots above and below, can you do a similar thing, except this time turn the knots to the left? So it goes so that the knots are oriented to the ceiling, and then they move so that they're on the inside of the right leg, and then they come back. And we won't spend the same time here, but do a couple movements of just 1/4 turn, and then do a couple movements of a half turn where the knots will come all the way to the back of the leg, but you're beginning the movement by going to the left. And then 3/4 of a turn, beginning to the left, returning by going to the right. A long spine, a face that could smile and expose the teeth, an easy breath. And then a full turning of the 2 knots from the front of the kneecap, moving to the left to come back to that place of being on the front of the kneecap and returning to the right. Do that a couple times. Long spine, easy face, easy breath, and pause again. And then continuing to have your attention on all of these elements, can you begin to play with turning the knots once to the left, maybe just a 1/4 turn, and then once to the right, and see what's different about imagining the movement to the inside versus to the outside. And maybe you feel something clearly right away, maybe not. But then you can try by turning a half turn, going to the back of the leg, but start once to the left and start once to the right. And then you can grow the movement eventually to a full circle in either direction. But I'll speak from my own experience again. I always had this sensation that when I would turn one of the knots and then come back, it was as if something inside me felt like it was kind of winding up, and then it was letting go to come back. So notice if you have that sense of winding in one direction or the other, which would mean that just returning by moving to the left is not the same as starting by moving to the left. And another experiment I made, which might interest you, is to turn the knots all the way around the leg in one direction and then continue for a second turn. And then can you think of unwinding by taking 2 full turns to come back to the beginning? So these are just little experiments. Maybe you'll find subtle differences, or maybe not so much. But I just invite you to explore that with a long spine, with a free breath, with a face ready to smile. And then leave it alone. But notice if something's different now on that side where you were turning those imaginary knots. And now, please have your legs long. And if you didn't have enough to pay attention to before, Feldenkrais asks you to do the same thing that you just did, but now you do it while you stand the right foot and lengthen it. So make it slow. Take your time, because as you bring the leg to the outside and then stand the foot, you have knots above the knee and below the knee, and they're turning. Let's say they turn a 1/4 turn in one direction and come back. And then as you take, if you have the feet standing, you take the knee to the outside, lengthen. You're doing this frog leg process that we worked on so much yesterday, but you're doing it with knots tied above and below your knee. And those knots turn in one direction and then they come back to the middle. It probably is useful to just stick with one idea with the knots for several turns. So let's just say they turn a quarter turn to the outside and then they come back. And all the while, you are doing this frog leg movement. And you have a long spine. You have a soft, ready to smile face where you could even expose your teeth. Your breath is easy. It's a whole laundry list if you try to do it all at once, but maybe there's a way you begin to form more of this one experience. If you do this same thing, but now you let the knots turn in and out a little towards the inside of the leg as you're doing it, does that change the feeling of doing the frog leg? And again, if you feel for a moment the spine shortens or something tightens in the face and the smile wouldn't be there, it's just showing you that you're engaged in a very challenging process. There's no need to worry that you're not holding on to everything. But if you do notice that tightening in the face, if you do notice a shortening in the spine, it's Feldenkrais's way of showing you that there's some things that are maybe beyond your control. And he shows you by giving you a very complex task to work with. But so, if anything, what begins to happen is as you do the frog leg movement, if you like, let go of the image of the knots for a moment, but can you now really kind of get a clearer sense of, in addition to the knee going to the outside and coming back and the movement, you get a sense of the rotation of the leg, which was always there, but if you imagine those knots just being tied there and not moving, where would the knots be pointing to at any given moment during the frog leg? And then can you actually have moving knots where the two knots are turning around your leg? Okay, so stand both feet now. Feel the sensation in the low back on the left side and the right side. And now, something you did yesterday, you're not going to do a full frog leg of lengthening the legs, but if you just begin with both legs, let the knees move out to the side and then come back. And what do you feel on the side where you just had two knots above and below the knee? No, so the knees go apart from each other. You're not tilting them together. You take the knees to the outside. Does it feel like one leg, that the movement in the hip joint, the weight of the leg, the inclination to move one leg first, is it different? So actually don't go so far as lengthening the legs. Just in that first moment of taking the knees a little to the outside, what do you notice between the two legs? Okay, and now have the feet standing again. And you'll see this is only gets stranger as we go along. So imagine now that there was a string tied just above the left knee. But it's not going to stay there. In fact, we'll imagine there's enough room for the string to do this. You're going to slide that string upwards. And you understand now why he calls the lesson Knots in the Crotches. Doesn't sound so pleasant when you hear the title. But he actually asks you to use your hands now. If you think of like putting on, something like a pantyhose or a long sock or a pair of pants, use your hands to pull the string up as high as you can get it. So literally put your hands on your leg and you imagine there's a string and you pull it up so that you can imagine that this string is tied right up into the crotch, into the groin. And of course, what happens is the string won't go as far up right underneath the pelvis near your perineum. On the outside of the leg, it can come up a little higher. When I did this, I found I was even adjusting my pants so that I could really feel the seam at the top of the leg there. So he invites you to use your hands, but in any case, you want to create an image now that that string is very snug right up at the top of the left leg. So we've switched to the other leg and we're not putting the string in the same place, we're putting it in a new place. And then one last change is that the place that we're going to tie the knot to begin with is not facing the ceiling, it's on the inside. So right there next to the perineum, in a very intimate place, that's where that string is right now. And it's the left leg. And so from here, you're going to turn the string to the right. What that means is the knot that's more or less between your legs is going to move to the back of your leg or somewhere on the buttock, wherever you would feel that a string going all the way around would go a half turn, because it's starting on the inside and it turns back a quarter turn and then it returns to the inside place between your legs. Okay? So please make that movement in your imagination many times, gently, and again, return to the idea of having a long spine, an easy breath, a face that could smile. You can actually test the smile, see if you can expose the teeth, and if you feel that there's tension in the face, can you also notice what's going on in your chest? Is there somewhere you could be softer in the chest as you turn this knot a quarter turn from the inside of the leg to the back and then return? And feel, does this image produce some kind of little sensation in the left leg? Okay, pause for a moment. And now thinking of that knot in the same starting place, instead of continuing, you're going to this time turn to the left. And instead of going a quarter turn, you're going to go a half turn. So turn the knot from the inside of your left leg all the way across the front side to the outside of the left leg, somewhere near the greater trochanter, maybe just above. What I mean is that place in the femur where the leg angles into the hip joint. And if you put the heel of your hand on the outside of your pelvis with the fingers going straight down, if you put the heel of the hand on the top of the pelvis, on the outside of your pelvis, not the thigh, but the outside of the pelvis, if you put the heel of your hand on in other words, the other side of your palm from your fingers, you put that at the top and then you reach down your leg somewhere near your middle finger, you'll feel the greater trochanter. Okay. There's a bony bump there somewhere. If the heel of your hand is not on the pelvis, you're probably reaching too far down. In any case, it's just a landmark for you, but you're turning this knot now from the inside across the front to the outside of the leg. You can have your arm resting on the floor or wherever you'd like to rest it. So notice you're turning it in the opposite direction from what you just did, and you're making a larger turn. What sensations do you feel around the left hip joint as you do this? What do you feel in the spine? If you were just kind of inattentive to the spine, would your spine wish to shorten if you did this movement? You just sort of let your spine do anything at all, and you make this turning. What is the spine? How does it react? And then what happens if you deliberately make the intention of keeping a long spine? Okay, pause for a moment. And now go to the right again, but this time 3/4. 3/4 turn to the right. So starting from between the legs, it goes around the back, it goes around the outside, and then it stops somewhere on the front of your thigh. And then reverses around the outside to the back and in between the legs again. With attention to breath, spine, the possibility of a smile. And then take a brief rest and then begin exploring full circles of this knot. The starting point is always at that place on the inside at the top of the left leg, but you take the knot around the leg once to the left and come back, and you take it around once to the right. All the while with this long spine, this friendly demeanor in the face, easy breath. Great, and now lengthen your legs. Just take a rest. Just feel what's there. You didn't do the same thing on the right side and the left side. Just feel what's the imprint on the floor right now. Okay, now stand your feet again. And I'm going to suggest that you continue working with the knots in the way you were just doing, with a full turn from the inside of the left leg in one direction and then a full turn in the other direction. Go back to that long spine, breath, easy face. But now as you do this, can you just tilt the left leg a little bit to the outside and bring it back? Just the left leg. It tilts to the outside and it returns. But as it does so, you're turning these knots. Maybe you just do a full turn of the knot as you tilt the leg, and you do the return movement as you bring it back. Let's do it that way so we can be precise and have a precise experiment. And do it a couple times beginning in one direction and see what does the movement feel like there. There's kind of a complex visualization that you're doing here. And then do a couple times where the movement is going in the other direction, but it's one circle to take the leg out and one circle to take the leg back. And so what it might feel like is one time you're doing an experiment where the knots are moving more or less in the direction that the leg is actually going. And the other time it might feel like the knots are going opposite what the leg is doing. You might get the sense that one of these two is easier than the other. Okay, pause. And then there's so many possibilities, but just do a couple more movements of tilting the left leg to the left and just play with the knots. Maybe make another very clear comparison of two things, or maybe just make up a game. But can you Have that easy breath. Lengthen the spine. And also, when you're really challenging your attention, one of the places that you might feel it is in the eyes, because we're working with this visual image. It's also an image of something you might feel. But just notice if you're straining the eyes at all. Can you have soft eyes? Notice the throat. Is the throat open to allow the air to move through easily? Can you have ease in the roof of your mouth, your eyebrows, your abdomen? And another interesting thing Feldenkrais says is, as you do this movement, if you think of the back of your left thigh, from the hip joint out to the knee, he says, as you do the movement, you think of that line lengthening from the hip joint out to the knee at the same time that the spine lengthens upwards. See if that idea is interesting or useful to you. And then bring the knee over the foot and just rest. Keep your feet standing. And now go back to the experiment you made earlier. You remember we did this right after working with 2 strings on the right knee. And you took the knees both to the outside. You felt something maybe on one side. Now if you do it again, is it the same leg that feels simpler? Or is there a shift? What's it like now to open the knees away from each other and bring them back? What do you feel in the 2 hip joints? Okay, just enough to notice if there's a shift in that experience. And rest. If you'd like, you could rest with the legs long. Maybe you could do a frog leg with both legs, or whatever you want. Rest on the floor. Now, when you're ready, with attention to keeping the spine long, all the elements we've been talking about, take one leg out to the side as a frog leg, the heel coming in, stand one foot, thinking of a long spine, a quiet back, and then the other leg. Okay. And now the next crazy idea, it's not mine, it's Feldenkrais's, so you can get mad at him, not me. Now you're going to have 3 strings. But the good thing is you're going to fill in the gaps that we're missing. So please tie a string above and below the left knee. Take a moment to feel that that happens and that there's knot on the front of the knee, above and below. And now please tie a string around the top of the right leg, and once again use your hands to really pull that string up as high as it can go, so you can feel it's right up into the groin on the right side. And in the same way as we did earlier, we're going to situate the knot at the top of the right leg on the inside. So you have a knot on the inside of the top of your right leg, and you have knots on the front of your left knee, above and below. So just take a moment to really feel those 3 strings one at a time. Feel where the knots are. Again, above and below the front of the left knee, and along the inside of the top of your right thigh. And as we've done all along, we're going to turn these strings in quarter segments. And you're going to turn all 3 of these strings to the right. So what that means is that the 2 strings on the front of your left knee come to the inside, while the string that's between the legs, on the right leg, it's going to come to the front of the thigh. And then all 3 strings go back to where they began. Just take a minute to see if you can even put that together. It's not a simple process. So again, the starting position is there's 2 knots on the front of the left knee and a knot on the inside of the top of the right leg. And then the place you go to is that there's 2 knots on the inside of the left knee and a knot on the front of the top of the right leg. And now see if you can continue to work with this idea of turning all 3 knots to the right. And every time it just gets too frustrating or strange, you just let it go. But then you come back and see if you can eventually turn the knots to the right a half turn. And of course, with a long spine, friendly face, an easy breath. So to turn the knots a half turn, the knots that are on the front of the left knee will end up on the back of the left knee, and the knot on the inside of the top of the right leg will end up on the outside of the top of the right leg. And see if you can figure out maybe one at a time, where would those knots go to if they went 3/4 of a turn? Maybe you put them together one at a time. Maybe sometimes you do the movement and you realize, oh, I turned some strings more than the other ones. And then eventually all the strings turn a full turn to the right, so that the strings on the front of the right knee are going to go all the way around and come back to the front of the right knee. The strings, or the one string that's at the top of the right leg, the knot will go from the inside to the right, across the front, and to the outside and the back, and end up on the inside again. Okay, pause here. Just breathe. I was talking to someone I've worked with today who sometimes finds Feldenkrais lessons to be very difficult because of this question of attention. And I pointed out, well, that's one of the things you can do during a rest is just forget about it all. Just wipe your mind clean. It's as if you're not trying to figure out anything for a minute or two. That's one approach. Okay, but when you're ready, you come back. There's 2 knots on the front of the left knee, 1 knot on the inside of the top of the right leg. And now begin to turn the knots in segments of 1/4 turn to the left. And just find out what that's like. I won't spell out all the landmarks for you, but you can probably find them. And you work with a 1/4 turn, a half turn, 3/4 of a turn, full turn. Long spine, easy breath. So this image itself being kind of challenging as an image, just notice if effort comes up because you're trying so hard to imagine something. It can definitely happen. You think of some stressed out teenager taking an exam and what their face would look like as they're concentrating. They're concentrating with their thinking above all, but it shows up in the body. So just notice if the difficulty of working with the image creates a strain anywhere. Okay, take a rest. And now let's just say you work with the strings going 1/4 of a turn in one direction and coming back. Let's make it as simple as we can. You choose if they go to the right and the left. See if you can create that image that they go 1/4 turn in the same direction and then come back again and again, and get that feeling. And now as you continue to visualize this, you continue to have the same attention to your spine, to your breath, to your face, to anywhere you might be doing extra effort. You begin to once more take the knees a little apart and then bring the knees back over the feet. But you have these knots, these 3 knots, turning from their starting positions a 1/4 segment to one side and coming back. And you know which direction you're turning, but keep doing the same direction. And the strings on both legs are going the same directions. They're not turning away from each other. They're turning in the same direction. And you're taking the knees apart and bringing them back to bed together. Can you do all this without holding the breath, without shortening the spine? Okay, take a little rest and then return to the movement, but turn the knots in the other way. You're almost at the end, don't worry. But when you're ready, again, the knees widen to the side and come back. You have 2 strings on the left knee, 1 string at the top of the right leg. And now I'll just offer you something. I don't know, Feldenkrais might scowl at me for doing this, but we'll do it anyway. It's just an offering, you decide. So what I find fascinating is this is the last movement of the lesson. So in terms of the strings, you worked with one knee, the other thigh, and then the remaining knee and thigh all together. And he didn't give you this experience of doing it with both legs in the other position. But if you want, you could play around with that. You could put 2 strings on the right knee and 1 string at the top of the left leg just to check it out. Or you could trust Feldenkrais, because I think his attitude is that we don't always have to do it on the left, on the right. Do it this way on this side and do it this way on the other side. He actually took you through all of these points, but he did it in quite a peculiar way. In any case, it's his individual contribution to come up with this whole process and then to create the structure around it. But I feel like if there's value here, you can take these knots and these strings and you can play with them in other ways. So that's a little bit of what I did. And now maybe just let go of those strings, leave them alone, and if you're curious, take 1 more minute to play with your frog legs, whether it's 1 leg at a time or both legs. But see if even without the strings, you maybe have a different image of the legs and the segment of your lower leg. In other words, related to that string that was below the knee, and then the upper leg. And we could have gotten into a whole discussion of what's happening in and around the knee, what's happening in the hip joint, which I think this helps you begin to feel. But in any case, you can think of all these landmarks Or you could imagine if you did tie knots around the legs, you just imagine at any given moment, where is the inside of the top of my leg as I do the movement? Where is the outside of my knee as I do the movement? And can you have a long spine? Can you smile and expose your teeth and breathe? Great. Leave it all alone. The end. No more of those crazy knots, crazy strings. Just rest and feel what may have shifted. Sure, roll the head if you like. What do you feel in your spine here? And the length of all the limbs. And then when you're ready, you can roll to one side. If you wish, stand the feet first, however you like. And come into sitting. And eventually come up into standing. Just allow yourself to sink into the sensation for a moment. Not needing to explain why you feel what you feel. Just feel it. And begin to walk around the room. Just notice what's new here. And I won't take you on a whole journey, but just to give you some idea, if you want to try this, what I was doing the other day while I was running is you keep walking around the room, but you imagine one of those strings maybe tied along the top of the inside of one leg. And if you walk and you start turning the string, does something change in the sensation of how you're using that leg as you walk? And I'm not suggesting it's a good idea that helps you walk better. I'm just saying, does something change? And does something change in a particular way if you turn the string one way, and another particular way if you turn it the other way? So I only mean to suggest if something changes, there might be a tool there that you could play with. I was running and I didn't like the feeling I had. My left hip joint wasn't as comfortable, and I played with strings on my left leg the whole time I was running. I was not lying on the floor, but by the time I was done running, my left hip joint felt better than my right by the end. Okay, well, that's our second class. And I see that I actually went a minute over our time, but I will just find out if either of you want to say something. I'll just unmute everyone.
It was a lot.
Yeah.
It was like being in a trance.
Cool.
Yeah.
And after the trance, how did you feel when you came out of the trance?
Okay.
I couldn't catch that.
It's good. It's okay. It's I felt a lot of connections inside the body. Moving with the upper string in the left leg, I felt here a lot of things happening. So
Yeah.
What happened?
Interesting.
The body, yeah.
I have an ongoing issue around my right shoulder, my right arm, and at many moments when I was doing the lesson and having some difficulty with the image or all of the moving parts of what I was I would feel myself tightening in that place, which is that place that I tend to tighten in whatever situation. So that was interesting. How about for you, Christine?
I found it very hard, and I didn't realize that until you mentioned it, that my eyes were really straining. And so then I would close my eyes to try to quiet them, but then I maybe fell asleep. And then I said, okay, now I have to keep my eyes open. But then I would sort of starting to look really intently. I was efforting a lot with my eyes. And then I tried to, I guess, think about what's happening with the rest of my body. And so then when it got better for me, I felt more movement in other parts of my body. And I started to feel just more movement in general. And I seemed to sort of get, the exercise started to become a little more comfortable for me. But it was very mentally challenging.
Yeah, definitely is. Did either of you feel physical sensations when the strings were moving? Did that produce a... Yeah, that's quite interesting. I will admit that I think Colette said it perfectly. It's a lot. Yet what I also found, and this whole story of how I played with it when I'm running, is when you understand the process. Like if you just imagine doing this lesson again without any surprises, like I know if we're going to do this and we're going to do that. If you came back a second time, can you imagine how there's room to learn more through getting a little more familiar with this process? It's, you know, as promised, I did not pick. You can see why I said they're not the lessons that are normally taught in the public classes, but I think I might find out at the end of this that I'm the only one, but I find there's a lot of value, and it's these small particular things, but those feelings that you got, even the strain in the eyes, or what Colette mentioned is going on for her in the chest, those little sensations, those little things are partially a response to what is being asked in this particular situation, but they're also partly a reflection of those things that we're doing all the time, right? We just don't quite notice them, so that when we move very slowly and mindfully through a quite challenging situation, we start to notice in a very kind of acute way those things that we might do all the time when we're in difficulty, but it's just so normal to us that they don't pop out. So any case, you definitely should be congratulated on going through this process.
You too. I can imagine it is very hard to teach this lesson, because you see not very much happening, I think. What do you?
Yeah, well, as you can imagine, I learned it from a transcript of an Israeli speaking English and starting over. I don't know if you can see this, but I have these little drawings that I was making so I could understand. I mean, it took me a while to even figure out what does he mean. So I definitely spent quite a long time figuring this out. But I will tell you that it's become a very satisfying process for me to do the more I've done it. And, you know, I guess as people go through this course, and many people see the recording, will be interesting to hear back. But I would just submit to you that, yes, it's a challenge, but what did you learn from the challenge? And is it worthwhile to go through such a challenge as this? Maybe if you come back to it, you think, you know, I'll do half of it next time, or maybe you just think, you know, I will take more breaks, or whatever you do. But I think there's something really valuable in there. So in any case, it was a pleasure to share it, and I don't know when I'll be teaching it again, but we have this recording for history, and I'm glad you were there with me.
Well, I got a lot out of it. It was very, very difficult doing it, and at some points I thought, I don't know where this is going for me in my body, but I'm just going to continue following and when we stood up to walk around, I felt, well, even as we were lying partway through the ATM, I felt like my pelvis was more stable left to right. And the subtlety of the knots, there's something happened where I didn't feel like I had to make these macro movements with my pelvis. And then when we stood up, I was surprised that I felt good because it's so mentally challenging. And I felt, as I walked, I felt parts of my pelvis and my hip and the back, just little places that I had not felt before. There's more subtlety. And so that was really helpful for me, really interesting. So it was difficult, but afterwards, it's like things got awakened. So like new parts that I hadn't felt before. So that overall, it was really good, but it was difficult at the time.
Yeah, well, that's an amazing result, right? To feel parts of you that you feel like you never felt before. Wonderful. Okay. Well, so again, I'll be curious I don't know if you'll both be able to make the last live session tomorrow. I hope you can. But in any case, it'll also be interesting to just see how this percolates for you over the course of the rest of your evening, other things you're doing. And again, if the knots and the movements was challenging, or even too much, like you don't want to deal with it anymore, you can still orient to this new feeling, these new parts of yourself you can feel now. That's something you want to hold on to. So, keep playing with it. All right, I think we better wrap this up. But yes, one more class, and it won't be as mentally challenged. I can promise you that, at least tomorrow. But another very fun lesson, I think, to round out our series. Okay, so thanks very much. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.